Dr. Harriet HARDEN DAVIES follows on, and I think it's very interesting that she's following on, because you will see a presentation which will highlight how the proposals in the BBNJ have built on UNCLOS. And so who is Dr. Harriet HARDEN DAVIES? Dr. HARDEN DAVIES is the director of the Nippon Foundation, University of Edinburgh Ocean Voices Program. And her research interests include ocean governance and equity, marine conservation and sustainable development, capacity building, and ocean stewardship. She co-founded the Early Career Ocean Professional Program under the UN Decade, UN Ocean Decade, and is a member of the UNESCO IOC group of experts, which is very key. I assume most of you know the role of the IOC in capacity building. And her PhD and postdoctoral research focused on the development of a new UN treaty for marine biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction. And the last thing I'd mention of her distinguished career is that she is co-lead of the Deep Ocean Stewardship Initiative. Many of us might know of the work of that initiative. And she's also a member of the editorial board for marine policy. So please, Dr. HARDEN DAVIES, do take the podium.
Thank you so much, Judge Brown, for that kind introduction, and thank you so much to the organising committee for giving me this tremendous honour of joining you today and sharing a presentation on this, I'd say, very important issue of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And what a pleasure it is to speak after you, Ligia, my friend and great facilitator of this issue. Preparing for this presentation, these words came to mind. And these words were spoken to me on a particularly hot day in August 2016. It was my first time in New York. It was my first time in America, actually, and my first time anywhere near the United Nations as a PhD student. I was very excited, as you can imagine. And I was particularly honored because I've been invited to speak with the African group, thank you very much, Judge Joyini and colleagues, about capacity building and transfer of marine technology. And on that day, I had the privilege of talking to an esteemed Law of the Sea scholar and negotiator about this issue. And they said this to me: the capacity building and technology transfer was usually one of the easiest things to negotiate, but the hardest to implement. And I've added the ... question mark because it's not for me to argue one way or another. I'll leave that to the negotiators to comment on that. But those words really stuck with me for years, and they returned to me when I was preparing for this talk. And the reason is that this issue of capacity building in particular, and when technology transfer follows, it kind of has the same effect, seems to have a bit of a warm, fuzzy feeling. We can agree capacity building is a nice thing. And indeed, it does seem to be something that is quite easy to agree with. But actually, when you get down into the nitty-gritty, we can see that it's in fact a very challenging issue. It's been a very contentious issue, and one that actually, perhaps sort of entering the fifth session, if anyone was feeling nervous, I'm sure perhaps not only the key negotiators there, would be very understandable given how tricky and contentious technology transfer has been in the law of the sea historically. And so that really just sort of struck with me as I was thinking around this issue, and I'd like to explore that a bit in my presentation today. And I'd also like to begin by thanking my colleagues in the Ocean Voices programme and acknowledging and recognising the fact that ultimately this issue of thinking about capacity building is about people. And as a person, like all humans, my capacity and ability to understand issues like capacity building is affected and in some cases limited by my own position and experiences. And I really acknowledge and offer you that acknowledgement that my perspective on this is shaped by who I am and where I'm from, and to really deeply thank my colleagues who have shared their experiences with me on this topic and helped me to open up my horizons on this issue around what capacity building means, who's involved, and what the role of the law of the sea is in shaping it, both its practice and theory. And today I'm going to cover three key areas. Firstly, I'm briefly going to introduce the issue of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And in doing so, I'm going to give some of the historical context and contemporary context that hopefully will elucidate some of the challenges that were the backdrop for these negotiations and why they're so significant, I would argue, not only in areas beyond national jurisdiction, but could have far wider reaching implications. Secondly, I'm going to walk us through the BBNJ agreement with respect to capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, following or in some cases skipping over issues that my colleague Ligia has already followed us through. But I'm going to argue that the BBNJ agreement takes us beyond the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea in 5 key ways and highlight some of the really exciting innovations that it provides. But I'm going to close by highlighting a few of the challenges and opportunities for implementation and some of the areas where work can start now to get us ready to hit the ground running post-ratification. So the significance of capacity building and transfer of marine technology in the context of the agreement has really been around enabling all states to participate fully, to exercise their rights and responsibilities under the agreement, and to get to some of those issues of fair and equitable that colleagues on the MGR panel yesterday spoke to. But when we think about the high seas, having just a few states able to understand what lives in the high seas, to see who's doing what, and be able to implement the provisions of an agreement like the BBNJ agreement, it can't rely on just a couple of states to be able to do that. It really does need everybody. So achieving the overall objectives of the agreement is very reliant on capacity building and technology transfer. And as Judge Brown mentioned in the introduction, a lot of focus does indeed go on some of the scientific and technological aspects, given the technical nature of so many of these issues. But it's really important to also recognise that the capacity building required, as many colleagues on the EIA panel mentioned this morning, also has very important implications around policy, legal, regulatory capacity, financial capacity, and the institutional capacity, not just of individual states, but of the international architecture itself. And a lot of the time, particularly someone like me who's been following this closely, I tend to say CBTMT as one acronym like it's one thing. But of course, there's 2 very different concepts involved. Capacity building and the transfer of marine technology are 2 very different things, but they're also linked. And I want to walk us through a couple of examples just to give some colour to what they might be and how they might be linked. So I want to start with marine scientific research on the top. I think that's right-hand side for you, yes. So as was mentioned yesterday, the vessels needed to get out beyond 200 nautical miles and the underwater human or remote operated vehicles you need to do research really rest in the hands of just a few at the moment. So that focus on marine scientific research, technologies, tools and institutional capacity has been a big focus. And indeed, given the work that the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO has done thinking around technology transfer, there's often quite a close link between how technology transfer is discussed and marine scientific research. One of the really important developments in the BBNJ process was this expansion of the concept of technology transfer beyond that focus on understanding the ocean to a much broader focus on understanding what is happening on the ocean and how to actually implement conservation and sustainable use measures. An example of that is on the bottom right-hand corner, which is monitoring, control and surveillance technologies. So this was put forward by PSIDS and others and supported by many others in one of the earliest PrepComs to highlight that technologies to understand the ocean alone will not get the international community where they're seeking to get to. We really need a much more encompassing definition, and so thinking around other satellite or vessel-based or land-based technologies that are not only about understanding the ocean but seeing who's doing what are really important in implementing many of the provisions and getting to some of those enforcement issues that Dr. von Rebay and others spoke about yesterday. Two other examples, perhaps if everyone was to write down a definition of capacity building right now, you don't have to do this, but if you were to, and we were to stick them on the wall, I'd imagine that they'd be very different. But some of them might be thinking that capacity building is about a person, that it's about an individual. And indeed, some definitions of capacity building are very focused on individuals. And indeed, as we see in the agreement, and as we saw in the discussions, there's a lot of different skills and training that will be needed, ranging from science to legal and regulatory skills, and the technical assistance that Lisa Spear and others spoke to this morning as being really crucial for certain elements of the agreement. But there's also the issue of institutional capacity, which is really crucial now. That might be creating an actual physical space, a lab, a building, infrastructure in a place. We can also think about the institutional architecture of the agreement as being a place where capacity will reside and capacity may well need to be built. So in all of these examples, there are elements which are technological, but there's many elements which are not. And so whilst they are two distinct concepts, they are linked and do operate together. I want to just speak a little bit about that historical context, which is one of the things that really gave me pause for that idea around, is it really going to be the easiest to negotiate or not? Now, as we look at the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, there's many things that the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea does do with regards to the transfer of marine technology and capacity building. Now, Part 14 of the Law of the Sea Convention happens to be my favourite part. As I mentioned, I've been doing my research on this for some years, but I'm very alone on that. In fact, on my second year of my PhD, a very esteemed Law of the Sea colleague told me it was the boring bit that people flick through on the way to the juicy stuff on dispute settlement at the back of the agreement. Now, my great hope is that you will join me in ensuring that Part 14 is not the boring bit, and absolutely ensuring that Part 5 of the BBNJ agreement is never spoken of in such terms. But let's actually just get into that, jokes aside. So Part 14 does a lot of things. It actually sets a really aspirational framework for what the transfer of marine and development of marine technology is trying to achieve, to enable all states parties, particularly developing states, to exercise their rights and responsibilities. We also see lots of references to transfer of marine technology in Part 13 on marine scientific research, in other parts of the agreement, such as Article 202, and of course in Part 11. But despite that very aspirational framework that the Law of the Sea Convention does put forward, many of you would have heard the phrase under-implemented in a way of describing Part 14. Now, several would also disagree and say that a lot has happened, it just hasn't been captured. I'm not here to say whether it has or hasn't been. I'm just here to say that several delegates did comment and argue quite strongly that Part 14 had been under-implemented. And the scholars on this issue have highlighted a number of different challenges and limitations with Part 14 which have led to this perceived under-implementation. So the first of those is a lack of implementation mechanisms. UNCLOS is quite silent on how to achieve a lot of the development and transfer of marine technology that it puts forward. Institutional mandates, there's a few organisations that are identified. However, of course, there's naturally a sectoral approach which does happen, which means we often lack that holistic view of who is doing what and how it is going. We also have little or no process for monitoring, evaluation and learning in terms of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, and that is not in any way to discount valiant efforts that have been taken forward by many organisations, not limited to IOC UNESCO. But the fact is that getting data on how tech transfer has gone has proven to be very difficult for a number of reasons. And it's also important to recognise that technology transfer has been a highly contentious issue. Of course, I don't need to remind a room full of esteemed Law of the Sea experts that of course, the entry into force of the Law of the Sea Convention itself was dependent upon getting to a point which was acceptable to all states on the issue of technology transfer in the international seabed area beyond national jurisdiction. So it was indeed, of course, quite a perhaps nail-biting issue going into the BBNJ negotiations. And then just to give some examples of the contemporary context, so that's where we were with the Law of the Sea Convention, but what's happened in practice since then, and where were we now going into the negotiations in the past few years? Well, I want to give you sort of two examples on the sort of top right-hand side. These are the words that you can read. This is scientists that were interviewed as part of a study commissioned by the Alliance of Small Island States under the leadership of Ambassador Felsen some years ago, where scientists were interviewed to ask them their perceived challenges and opportunities for scientific research for marine genetic resources. And you can see that those words there, that the lack of meaningful or perceived meaningful capacity building that was really taking forward was one of the indicative examples of interviewee data highlighting that there was a big gap. And on the bottom right-hand corner there, this is data relating to the perceived adequacy of deep-sea research opportunities. The left-hand bars are responses from developed country participants, and the right-hand bars are from small and developing states. And you can see here that there is a huge disparity between the perceived adequacy of deep ocean research infrastructure, highlighting that there's still a long way to go. We've also seen a lot of terminology variations. I'm sure in your own work you've seen capacity building projects, capacity development projects, knowledge exchange projects, partnership projects. There's a lot of different ways of thinking around and communicating and describing capacity building. Now, that might just be semantics, it might just be terminology differences, but actually the little empirical studies that there have been on this issue suggest that this is part of a concerted effort to try to evolve how capacity building is discussed and done, moving away from historic donor-recipient models to far more long-term partnership models, which is something that Professor Morgera spoke to yesterday. And we are seeing practices evolving with that, as well as diversification of actors. So in the Law of the Sea negotiations, of course, there was a recognition that private sector might be playing a role in the transfer of marine technology, and that was indeed perhaps one of the concerns. But it's interesting to note now, here we are today, going into the BBNJ discussions, that it was not just governments and perhaps private sector, but the role of non-governmental organizations and foundations seen as playing a role in CBTMT. So it's a changing landscape, which brings changing challenges and opportunities. And those challenges we can really think of in 5 key ways. So the first is that, as I mentioned, there is very little in terms of empirical work on capacity building and the transfer of marine technology and the ocean space, particularly in areas beyond national jurisdiction. But of that, there are several indications that approaches are in some cases ineffective or inequitable. That's not in any way to cast aspersions on the intent, just simply to highlight there seems to be some really quite concerning evidence emerging that we could be doing a lot better. Some examples of that is research cruise participation that is not helpful, technology dumping that's more actually ends up perpetuating inequities that are there to address instead of being transferred in a way which is helpful, and some of the tokenism. So really some quite kind of concerning findings from some of the studies that are out there. And there's also continuing barriers to retaining capacity in country. And this figure on the right-hand side, some of you might have seen before, where the size of the country is distorted in comparison to the number of marine science publications. So we're really seeing that this is in 2021, so we still have a long way to go to reach those aspirations that UNCLOS was really very clear on in terms of marine science institutions and centres of excellence in countries, for example. A couple of other challenges that we saw were around stop-start in funding, having one-off workshops, for example, or having really very little or gaps in needs assessments and strategies to meet those needs, as well as gaps and problems in monitoring and evaluation. Lots of focus on quantity, but it being much more difficult to get to the quality of outcomes. So against those challenges, I now want to highlight how the BBNJ agreement has addressed those. So I'm going to skip over the enablers, because that's going to come. So the BBNJ agreement has in many ways addressed those challenges. And I would like to just now walk us through how that has happened. Now, when we look at capacity building and the transfer of marine technology in the BBNJ agreement, of course, we've got Part 5, and I'm going to walk us through that in a moment. But before I do, I wanted to acknowledge the fact that we do also see references to capacity building and the transfer of marine technology throughout the agreement. It's part and parcel of the objectives of Parts 2, 3, and 4 of the agreement. There's crucial enabling mechanisms for Part 5 in the agreement relating to the clearinghouse mechanisms and funding. And as Likia mentioned, we also have the annex, which provides a more detailed description of the types of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. So what are the key advances that the BBNJ agreement made? So One of the first key advances that it went in terms of going beyond the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea is it provides that clearer understanding about what CBTMT is and what it means. And as Likia mentioned, it does that through descriptions of what's included in capacity building and through an actual definition of marine technology, which does take us a significant step forward. The second key advance that it gives us is a discussion as to why. Why are we doing CBTMT? Is it an activity? Is it a means to an end? Is it an outcome itself? And the objectives really give really important colour to that, as does the vision for marine technology that I'm going to highlight in just a moment. Really importantly, the agreement provides a number of mechanisms that actually give us the how of CBTMT, something that has been, many scholars have bemoaned was missing in the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It does this through obligations, through actual mechanisms, including for funding, monitoring, institutional structures, and information sharing, and provides an actual committee to support this work. And I'm going to talk about this now in more detail. So firstly, with regards to the definition, as Likia mentioned, the biotechnology concept is included there, but I've highlighted in blue this important addition of text whereby it's related to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity. Now, the rest of that definition is very similar to the definition put forward by the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission of UNESCO in 2003 in their criteria and guidelines on transfer of marine technology. But what's really important about the addition in the agreement of that text in blue is it takes it from being applicable to understanding the ocean, i.e. basically a marine science activity, to being applicable to the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity itself. And that's really many things from data to know-how. You could actually argue that some of the tricky things about this definition, they're almost impinging on IP. I showed this to one of my colleagues. I said I would see know-how as being intellectual property, not technology. So it's a very broad-ranging definition of technology, which is at once consistent with what we already have of sort of soft law implementing under UNCLOS in the guidelines, but also takes it that step further. Regarding the objectives, there's a couple of things to really highlight here. So firstly, the objectives really highlight the need and importance of cooperation, and that is a very strong echo and hark back to Part 14 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It also includes some important language on participation, that focus on marine science and technology, that broad focus on knowledge, which is an important acknowledgement that traditional knowledge is very much part and parcel of that concept of knowledge. And it very much echoes the other parts of the agreement, as you can see there in paragraph E. The types of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, again, very much an echo back to Part 14 of the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. It's from the development and transfer of knowledge itself. It's from the skills and educational opportunities for individual people. It's hardware, it's software, and it's partnership. So it does give that very broad description and broad sort of remit for types of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. Furthermore, relating to cooperation, it not only sets out that strong duty to cooperate, but also provides some important specificity about that cooperation occurring at all levels and in several different forms, which is a really important sort of reflection of current practice and where best practice is and where it is going, including recognizing the role of diverse actors and that partnership building, which again reflects that growing evolution of practice towards partnership approaches as opposed to perhaps more traditional donation approaches in the case of many forms of CBTMT which are relevant to the agreement. And importantly includes that a language around reporting and requirements not being onerous. Modalities sort of part one, I would say in Article 42, does provide that sort of, as Likia mentioned, that split between capacity building and the transfer of marine technology, but importantly really emphasizes the need for it to be country driven. And what Article 42, Para 3 does was introduce that specific role for needs assessments, which again is reflecting current practice. It's picking up on practice and precedent in, for example, the climate change regime. And indeed then actually identifies mechanisms and supporting tools to actually facilitate the conduct of needs assessments, what to do with them, and providing that support to actually conduct them in the first place. The second modalities that Liki's already mentioned, but what I would add to what she's already said is that that sort of vision for that long term is again echoing where the current sort of practice and discourse is going, and does provide that sort of guidance as to how to do it. And I'll come back to the question of IP in just a moment. One of my favourite articles in part 5, as you can tell I'm a real fan, is this on monitoring and review. This monitoring and review article is something that really gives a really important hook to take the review, practice and implementation of CBTMT much further. Not only does it provide a mechanism and guidance about reviewing who's doing what in capacity building and tech transfer and how it's doing. It's a really important opportunity in terms of the mechanism that will be offered not just by the Capacity Building and Transfer of Marine Technology Committee, but the Conference of the Parties itself and potentially other bodies to provide that information sharing fora and recognising the role of different actors in that process. So that does provide that basis to move to understand not only how much is going on, but also to get to a measure of quality and impact of those long-term initiatives, which in the high seas are so often internationally cooperative, given the nature and scope of what we are, of course, talking about. And the establishment of the Capacity Building and the Transfer of Marine Technology Committee in Article 46 is a significant step forward and something which builds on, again, practice and precedent from other fora. But unlike in other agreements, including in the climate change fora, for example, where such a committee was not established in the treaty text, but took several years and several COP discussions later to establish, the BBNJ agreement has the potential for a head start by actually establishing it here in the text itself. And as Likia mentioned, this is going to be an important body to guide and monitor the implementation of CBTMT. As I mentioned, there's sort of two other really important enablers outside of Part 5 that are crucial for its implementation. The first is the role of the clearinghouse mechanism in sharing information, and also seen to have a very ambitious function to actually match needs and opportunities. And secondly, the financial mechanism outlined in Article 52 as a really crucial enabler of actually being able to ensure that funds are flowing to support many of these initiatives, although, of course, several of these initiatives are going to be very ambitious in scope, most likely, and perhaps go way beyond what the financial mechanism itself will be able to support, but time will tell. But I want to start closing up now by highlighting some of the challenges and opportunities for implementation. I hope that you are with me, that Part 5 does take us further than Part 14 of the Law of the Sea Convention, and perhaps you are converts now with me on being fans of both of these parts. But of course, having this really quite solid basis we now have for capacity building and technology transfer in Part 5 alone will not get us there. So what might be some of the different challenges that we might see? So the first question that we have relates to needs assessments. Now, needs assessments are positioned to play quite a pivotal role in shaping the capacity building and technology transfer provided and being a way of communicating information, perhaps via the clearinghouse mechanism, to other parties about what someone might need. But they in and of themselves do need capacity and do take funding. So actually ensuring early support for those needs assessment themselves would be something that would build on existing best practice and ensure that they are an enabler and not an impediment. Secondly is monitoring. As I mentioned, having provisions around monitoring and review is a huge step forward, but it's been really hard to do. And learning lessons about why monitoring CBTMT has been so difficult will be really important. And again, monitoring in and of itself does carry capacity challenges in and of itself. And so this is something where I think some novel technological tools could come in and actually having some focus early on how to set up a monitoring review system would be very, very helpful. Thirdly, information sharing. The clearinghouse mechanism is positioned to play a really crucial role in sharing information about needs and about opportunities. This goes beyond what currently exists and what has been achievable up until now. It's not the first time the idea of an online mechanism has been suggested, and I'm sure it is possible, but certainly learning as to what some of those challenges might be and ensuring something's fit for purpose will be really crucial. The fourth issue is, of course, funding. There is going to be a lot of different demands on the financial mechanism that I'm sure we'll get into the discussion of this afternoon. There's a good basis already in Article 52, but the agreement does give a nod to the expectation that there'll be several different actors and processes involved in financially supporting capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. And ensuring that the agreement does play its potential role in guiding and shaping the role of different actors, but at the same time avoiding the proliferation of different parallel processes is going to be one of the potential challenges, but also opportunities for operationalizing Part 5. The next point to make is in relation to the Capacity Building and Transfer of Marine Technology Committee. There's going to be some interesting questions there about the relationship of this committee with other bodies. As Ambassador Felsen mentioned yesterday in relation to marine genetic resources, the Access and Benefit Sharing Committee there is going to have some parallel synergies or perhaps overlaps with some of the issues of capacity building and transfer of marine technology, since so many of the non-monetary benefit sharing issues are in many ways could also be seen as being marine scientific research cooperation, access to data, skills, etc. So thinking about that committee relationship to sort of maximize synergies will be quite important. Another issue to mention on the committee is that having the committee there and having the provisions that Likia mentioned around representation is indeed really, really crucial, but learning from experiences of other bodies around the challenges of actually people taking up those seats. Having a seat on a committee is a great start, but there's a number of enabling measures you need. If you're an individual who works as a professor in their country and you need to get to these meetings several times a year, there's a number of things that would be helpful for us to think about in advance to make sure that those seats can be taken up in a meaningful way and used in a way that means that those bodies are operationalized that in the way that they could be. And finally, just to really sort of recognize, as I mentioned in my second slide, that ultimately this is about people working with people. And I recognize that we're here focusing on the role of international law in guiding how people behave, how states behave. But ultimately, as Professor Moreira mentioned yesterday, the politics, and I'm not talking so much between states here as I am thinking about from my own particular experience with different organizational types, and the power dynamics have the potential to really enable the operationalization of CBTMT or to hinder it. And I think having that in the back of our minds as we're thinking about these fantastic provisions and the potential to operationalize them will be really, really important to give effect to their potential. So just to summarize, there's really sort of 4 key points I want to leave you with. The first is that crucial importance of capacity building and the transfer of marine technology. It is at one time a part in of itself, at the same time it's something running through the agreement. It's an outcome of the agreement, it's an enabler of the agreement, and it's part and parcel of the mechanisms of the agreement, if we think about benefit sharing. So it really is there running throughout. Secondly, if we really sort of keep in mind the historical and contemporary challenges relating to CBTMT, not only under UNCLOS, but particularly under UNCLOS, it really highlights the importance of that how, the how bits, the enabling mechanisms, the funding, the coordination, the monitoring to really give effect to them and ensure that there's a common understanding about what they mean and how things are going, because we really saw that there was a divergence of different perspectives on how things have gone to date. And thirdly, that in many ways, the BBNJ agreement does advance the international community far beyond where the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea took us in relation to capacity building, and in particular, the transfer of marine technology. And it does that through the obligations that it introduces, the vision, the definitions, and the enabling mechanisms that it provides. And really, we do have a number of different ways where preparatory work can start now to pave the way for implementation. So I'd just like to say a humongous thank you to the organisers for giving me this privilege to speak with you today. and to share what I hope you've realised is my passion for these parts of the Law of the Sea Convention and the BBNJ Agreement, and to thank you so much, Judge Brown, for the opportunity to be on the panel. Thank you very much.
Well, we have a big thanks for Dr. Harden Davies. Clearly, I think that she has shown us how far the BBNJ agreement goes beyond the UNCLOS. And, you know, you mentioned, Dr. Davies, that Part 14 was seen as a boring section of UNCLOS. Well, I've heard much less flattering assessments of it. In fact, there's a commentary, a respected commentary, that suggests in part that Part 14 may have died with the NIEO's demise. That's the new international economic order. And I think what you've shown us is whether or not that is true or false. The BBNJ agreement is bringing new life into CBTMT and giving developing countries new hope for what lies ahead. So we're looking forward to implementation, not just the agreement. The implementation will be key.